The year was 1884, and the land held its breath under a sky the color of a faded bruise. For Elias Vance, the world had shrunk to the size of his homestead, a small, lonely island carved from the vast, indifferent prairie of the Dakota Territory. The silence in his cabin was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on him, thick with the ghosts of laughter and a small voice calling for its father. It had been 2 winters since diphtheria had stolen his wife, Hannah, and their son, Thomas, leaving Elias a hollowed-out man, tending the embers of a life that had already burned to ash. His days were a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival that asked for nothing but muscle and sweat, and for that he was grateful. He chopped wood until his arms screamed, the sharp crack of the axe a welcome intrusion into the quiet. He mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness. He spoke only to his mule, a creature whose dumb patience felt like a form of companionship. He was a man living in the past tense, his heart a locked room, the key long since lost in the cold earth beside 2 simple wooden crosses on a nearby hill. The nearby town of Redemption Creek was a place he avoided whenever possible. It was a raw settlement of dirt streets and false-fronted buildings that baked in the summer and froze in the winter, populated by people whose piety was as thin as their walls. They were suspicious of strangers, and doubly so of a man who preferred his own company. They looked at Elias with a mixture of pity and contempt, seeing his grief not as a wound but as a weakness, a failure to simply move on. They whispered about him, the widower on the edge of the prairie, a man who had forgotten how to speak to his own kind. He felt their judgment like a change in the weather, a cold front moving in whenever he rode down the main street for salt, flour, or coffee. On one such trip, with the autumn air carrying a sharp, biting promise of the harshness to come, Elias found the town's usual grumbling quiet, replaced by a tense, expectant hum. A crowd had gathered in the dusty square before the sheriff's office, their faces a grim tableau of cruel curiosity and nervous excitement. At the center of the gathering, tied to the thick hitching post usually reserved for unruly horses, was a woman. She was young, Lakota, with hair as black as a raven's wing and a face carved from proud defiance. Her hands were bound tight to the wood, her chin held high, though a tremor ran through her slender frame. Sheriff Callahan, a man whose authority was inflated by his own self-importance, stood before her, unrolling a long black leather whip. "This is what happens to thieves in Redemption Creek," he boomed, his voice slick with righteousness. This woman, caught red-handed trying to steal a bolt of calico from Mr. Donovan's mercantile. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elias watched from the edge, his hand resting on his mule's neck. He had seen the woman in town before, trading beaded crafts for necessities. He had also seen the way Mr. Donovan watched the native folk who entered his store, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, his hands never far from the shotgun he kept beneath the counter. Elias knew a lie when he heard one, and the sheriff's proclamation stank of it. The woman said nothing. Her silence was more powerful than any denial. It was a wall of dignity against which their accusations broke and fell away. "The punishment," Callahan declared, savoring the moment, "is 50 lashes, to serve as a lesson." 50 lashes. The words struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. It was a death sentence for a woman of her size. He had seen men broken by 20, their backs turned into a raw, bloody ruin. A cold horror washed over him, momentarily eclipsing the dull ache of his own grief. He saw the faces in the crowd, the leering, the indifferent, the few who looked down at their feet, ashamed but unwilling to act. He saw the whip in Callahan's hand, a coiled serpent ready to strike. And then he saw Hannah. He saw her in the final days, her body frail, her breath a ragged whisper, helpless against the fever that consumed her. He remembered the crushing impotence he had felt, the rage at a world that would let such goodness be extinguished without a fight. He had been powerless then, but he was not powerless now. Something inside him, a part he thought long dead, broke free from its cage of sorrow. Before he had consciously decided to move, his boots were crunching in the dust, carrying him through the parted crowd. He stopped a few feet from the sheriff, his shadow falling over the bound woman. The townspeople fell silent, their attention shifting to this unexpected interruption. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse but steady. Callahan turned, his face tightening with irritation. "Vance, this ain't your concern. Go on home." "I'll take it," Elias said. The words hung in the air, stark and unbelievable. Callahan blinked. "Take what?" "The punishment," Elias clarified, his gaze unwavering. "I'll take her lashes." A wave of stunned disbelief rippled through the crowd. The woman at the post twisted her head, her dark eyes wide with shock, searching his face. For the first time her composure seemed to crack, replaced by a profound confusion. Why would this stranger, this white man, do such a thing? Sheriff Callahan let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You've been out in the sun too long, Vance. Are you insane? Why in God's name would you do that for her?" He gestured dismissively at the woman. Elias didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the sheriff. He couldn't explain the storm of memory and rage inside him. He couldn't articulate the sudden, fierce need to stand against this casual cruelty, to do the one thing he could not do for his own family, to shield another from a fate they did not deserve. So he gave the only answer that made sense. "She didn't do it." "I'm the law here, and I say she did," Callahan snarled, his face reddening. "Now get out of the way." "Let her go," Elias said, his voice dropping low. "And I'll take the 50. Publicly, here and now. You'll still have your spectacle." The sheriff hesitated. The crowd was murmuring, their mood shifting from bloodlust to fascination. This was a better show than they could have hoped for. A madman defending an Indian. It was unheard of. Callahan saw the opportunity. Humiliating the grieving widower would be a far more potent lesson to any other would-be dissenters than simply whipping a native woman nobody cared about. "Fine," he spat, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Have it your way. Let it be known that Elias Vance values a savage's life over his own skin." He nodded to his deputy. "Cut her loose." The deputy, a young man with nervous eyes, quickly sawed through the woman's ropes. She stumbled forward, rubbing her wrists, her gaze locked on Elias. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a signal to go. She hesitated for a moment, a universe of questions in her eyes, before melting back into the crowd and disappearing. Elias turned and faced the post. He unbuttoned his shirt, his hands moving with a calm he did not feel, and shrugged it off, letting it fall into the dust. He placed his hands on the rough wood, his back bare to the expectant town. The sun felt hot on his skin. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, a crawling, prurient gaze. He closed his own, and for a moment the world was just the memory of Hannah's hand in his. The first lash was a line of pure fire, tearing across his shoulders. A gasp escaped his lips, choked off before it could become a cry. The crowd roared its approval. The second lash landed lower, crossing the first. The pain was blinding, absolute. It seared through flesh and muscle, a white-hot agony that erased all thought. He clenched his jaw, tasting blood where he bit his tongue. He lost count. The world became a cycle of searing pain, the whistle of the leather through the air, and the sickening impact. The roars of the crowd began to fade, replaced by a stunned, uneasy silence as the reality of the punishment unfolded. This was not a show anymore. This was a man being methodically flayed. He focused on the grain of the wood under his palms, on the rhythm of his own ragged breathing. He would not scream. He would not give them that. At some point, the pain became a distant, roaring ocean. His knees buckled, but he forced them straight. His vision swam in a red haze. He felt a presence nearby, heard a voice raised in anger. "That's enough, Callahan. You'll kill him." It was Dr. Amos Blackwood, his voice a sharp scalpel cutting through the thick silence. The whipping stopped. The sudden absence of pain was as disorienting as the blows themselves. Elias's hand slid down the post, and the world tilted, dissolving into blackness. He collapsed into the dust, a broken heap at the foot of the town's cruel justice. His return to consciousness was slow and agonizing. He was aware of a jolting motion, of a rough blanket beneath him, of a voice murmuring nearby. He was in the back of a wagon. Dr. Blackwood was there, steering the horses, his face a grim mask of fury. "Fools, a town of bloodthirsty fools," the doctor muttered, more to himself than to Elias. "Hold on, son, I'm taking you home." The journey was a blur of misery. Every rut and rock in the road sent fresh waves of agony through his back. By the time they reached his cabin, Elias was slick with sweat and shivering, on the edge of passing out again. The doctor, a surprisingly strong man for his age, managed to get him inside and onto his cot, face down. "This is going to hurt," Amos said, his voice gentle now, "but we have to clean it, or the infection will take you for sure." Elias gritted his teeth as the doctor worked, cleaning the horrific lattice of wounds with carbolic acid and water. The sting was a new and vicious torment. Afterward, Amos applied a thick, greasy salve that smelled of pine and herbs and bandaged him as best he could. "I'll leave the rest of this here," the doctor said, placing the jar on the small table. "Apply it twice a day. Boil any water you drink, and for God's sake, stay put." He looked at Elias, his expression a mixture of admiration and profound concern. "That was the bravest and most foolish thing I have ever witnessed, Elias. I don't know what possessed you." Elias couldn't answer. He could only manage a faint nod. The doctor left, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Elias lay in the dim light of his cabin, adrift in a sea of pain, his body a single screaming nerve. Fever began to creep in at the edges of his awareness, bringing with it distorted dreams of whips and winter snows. He was utterly alone, more vulnerable than he had ever been. Or so he thought. Sometime in the deep of the next day, through the haze of fever, he became aware of a presence. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a change in the air of the room. A floorboard creaked softly. The scent of wood smoke, freshly kindled, cut through the stale air. He tried to lift his head, but a wave of dizziness and pain forced him back down. He must have drifted off, because when he woke again, a cup of water was on the floor beside his cot, within reach. The fire in the hearth was burning low and steady, warding off the chill. He drank, the cool liquid a blessing on his parched throat. He was not alone. Over the next few days, this silent pattern continued. He would wake from pained, feverish sleep to find the fire tended, a small bowl of thin broth on the table, and his water bucket refilled. Once, in a moment of greater lucidity, he saw her. It was the Lakota woman from the town square. She moved with a quiet, ghost-like grace, her face impassive. She saw that he was awake, her dark eyes meeting his for a heartbeat before she turned and slipped out the door. She never spoke. She never approached him directly while he was conscious. But when the fever was high and his mind was clouded, he felt gentle hands cleaning his wounds, replacing the bandages with fresh ones coated in the doctor's salve and something else cooler, greener-smelling poultice of crushed leaves that seemed to draw the fire out of his skin. He existed in a state of confusion and suspicion. Why was she here? Was it pity? Gratitude? He was too weak to ask, too weak to protest. He was at her mercy, a thought that sat uneasily with him. But her care was undeniable. It was methodical, impersonal, and it was keeping him alive. The fever slowly began to recede, leaving him weak and drained, but clear-headed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. One morning, the light slanting through his window felt different, brighter. The pain in his back had subsided to a deep, throbbing ache. He managed to push himself up onto his elbows, his muscles protesting with every inch. He looked towards the door, expecting to see it empty. It was not. Standing just outside the open doorway, bathed in the morning sun, were 7 women. The woman he knew, the one who had been caring for him, stood slightly in front. Behind her were 6 others, ranging in age from a girl not much older than his Hannah to an elder whose face was a beautiful map of wrinkles. They were all dressed in traditional buckskin, their expressions serene and unreadable. They just stood there watching him, their stillness as profound as the prairie itself. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. Fear, sharp and primal, shot through him. Was this a trap? Was he about to pay a different price for his interference? He tried to push himself up further, a useless, defensive gesture. The woman he now thought of as his silent nurse took a step forward, holding up a hand as if to calm him. "Do not be afraid," she said. Her voice was low and clear, her English careful and precise. It was the first time he had heard her speak. "We have not come to harm you." Elias sank back onto his elbows, breathing heavily. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Winona," she said. "These are my mother, my aunts, and my sisters. We have come to speak with you." An older woman, the one with the wise, creased face, stepped forward to stand beside Winona. She looked at Elias, her eyes holding a deep, ancient knowing. She spoke in the Lakota tongue, her voice a soft, rhythmic cadence. Winona listened, then translated. "My mother, Istas, says that you have done a thing that has no name in your language. You, a white man, took the whip for one of our people. You took her shame and her pain and made it your own. You did this in the sight of your enemies and ours. This is an act of honor that shakes the foundation of the world we know." Elias stared at them, completely at a loss. I only did what I thought was right." "What is right for your people is to watch us suffer," Winona said, a flicker of old bitterness in her eyes before it was gone. "What you did was not right. It was sacred. You have created a great imbalance, a debt of the spirit." "I don't want anything," Elias insisted, shaking his head. "I want no payment. I need nothing from you." Winona shared a look with her mother. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what came next. "It is not about what you want. It is about what must be. A debt like this cannot be left unpaid. It would bring misfortune to us all. An act of such profound kinship must be answered with kinship. An act of family must be answered by making family." She paused, her gaze direct and unflinching. "My people have talked. My family has decided. We have come to honor you in the only way that can balance this debt. We have come to offer you a wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Elias felt as if the air had been punched from his lungs. A wife? He looked from Winona to the other silent women, their faces solemn and serious. This was no trick. This was a formal, deadly earnest proposal. You want me to marry one of you?" he stammered, his mind reeling. "No," Winona said softly, and for the first time she looked down at the floor. "They offer me to be your wife, to bind your house to my family, to care for the man who saved my life and my honor." Elias pushed himself to a sitting position, ignoring the fire that ripped across his back. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, his bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. He was dizzy, weak, and utterly overwhelmed. "No," he said, the word coming out as a harsh croak. "Absolutely not, I can't." The women's faces did not change, but he felt a shift in the room, a tension. "I am grateful for the care you've given me, Winona," he said, trying to make them understand. "More grateful than I can say, but I cannot marry you. I'm not a husband, not anymore." He gestured vaguely around the empty cabin, a space defined by loss. "My wife, my son, they are gone. The man I was died with them. What is left is not enough for anyone." He looked at Winona, pleading with his eyes. "I did not do what I did to get a reward. I did it because I couldn't stand by and watch. That's all. There is no debt." Winona listened, her expression softening with a hint of understanding, or perhaps pity. She spoke to her mother again in Lakota. The old woman listened, then responded at length. "My mother says you speak of your heart's sorrow," Winona translated, her eyes meeting his again. "We understand sorrow. My husband and my son were lost in the ghost winter, taken by the coughing sickness. My family knows the shape of an empty space in the home." The revelation stunned Elias into silence. She too was a survivor of a devastation he knew all too well. He looked at her not as a stranger, a representative of a foreign custom, but as a fellow traveler in the barren lands of grief. "She says," Winona continued, "that your spirit is wounded, just as your back is wounded. She says that a person cannot heal alone. It is not our way. You took my physical pain. Now, it is my place to help carry your spiritual pain. This is the balance. Marriage is the name we give it. It means I will stay. I will tend your fire. I will share your work. We will be a family against the wilderness. It does not mean you must forget your lost ones. It means you will not be lost with them." Before Elias could form a reply, the sound of hoofbeats and the rattle of a wagon shattered the morning quiet. A voice boomed from outside. "Vance, I know you're in there, and I know you've got squatters with you." It was Sheriff Callahan. Instantly, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The women, who had been serene and calm, became tense, their bodies coiled with a defensive stillness. Winona moved to the side of the doorway, peering out cautiously. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. Callahan had come to his home, to this place of quiet convalescence, to continue his campaign of petty tyranny. "Stay inside," Elias commanded in a low voice. Using the wall for support, he pulled himself to his feet. Every muscle screamed in protest. The pain in his back was a sickening, grinding fire. He swayed for a moment, his vision tunneling, but he forced himself to stay upright. He grabbed the hickory walking stick the doctor had left him and limped towards the door. He stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. Sheriff Callahan sat on his horse, a rifle resting across his saddle. His deputy was with him, looking even more nervous than he had in the town square. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice tight, "this is private property." "Not when it's being used to harbor vagrants," Callahan retorted, gesturing with his rifle toward the silent women who had gathered behind Elias in the doorway. "I'm giving you one chance, Vance. Send them packing, or I'll arrest the whole lot of them for trespassing, and you for harboring them." Elias looked back at Winona, at her mother, at the faces of the women who had come to offer him an honor he couldn't comprehend. He saw their quiet pride, their unshakable resolve. And he saw the sheriff, a man who built his power on fear and prejudice. In that moment, the choice became startlingly clear. His grief had isolated him, made him a passive observer of his own life. But the whip, and now this confrontation, had awakened something else, a duty, an allegiance. He turned back to Callahan, planting the end of his walking stick firmly in the dirt. He stood taller, the pain a distant thing now, burned away by resolve. "They are not vagrants," Elias said, his voice ringing with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "They are my guests. And this woman," he glanced back at Winona, meeting her wide, astonished eyes, "is under my protection." He took a half step to the side, positioning himself more fully between the sheriff and the women. It was a small movement, but it was a declaration. He was no longer just a man who had taken a whipping. He was a man who had chosen a side. Callahan's face darkened with rage. He had expected a broken, cowed man. He found a defiant one. "Is that so? You're choosing them over your own kind?" "They've shown me more kindness than my..."